Welcome everyone to the Nina Maria Gorrison lecture, Stepping onto the Pedestal, an animating history of art restitution from the Napoleonic Wars by Goff. We're especially grateful to Nina von Malzahn, who is a supporter, but most of all, a true and very long-term friend of the American Academy, who made this fellowship possible, and as such, of course, also was the driving force behind bringing Alice here. And this is very, very much appreciated. Usually, when we plan our semester, we actually look at the calendar, and most of the time we look onto Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then we set our events. And we never take into account any important holidays or celebrations that occupy the world. However, today it must have been a coincidence that Alice nearly missed, the International Day of Museums, which is being celebrated tomorrow. And this is, of course, of a special importance because Alice's research includes the history of museums, collections, and material culture. So anyone who does not have any special celebration plans for tomorrow can very well use this evening tonight and celebrate by listening to Alice's lecture. Before I introduce the most cherished colleague who will moderate tonight's events, let me briefly talk a little bit about the Zoom etiquette of tonight. You will all be able to ask questions by using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. The raise your hand function will not be activated, so you may very well use it, but nothing will happen. Sorry for that. Kirsten will take over the moderation and manage everything, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible, and if not, we will collect them, and Alice will then have the pleasure to answer them later if she would like to. No pressure, Alice, sorry for that. So now I come to the official part of the evening, and I will, as usual, introduce the introducer and the moderator. And this is Professor Kirsten Barnes, who is joining us from the US. And she is Associate Professor in German Studies at the University of Michigan and Director of Museum Studies the Museum Studies Program. She is the author of Sentiment und Sachlichkeit, der Roman der neuen Frau in der Weimarer Republik, published with Böhlau in 2003. And the co-editor of Weimar Subjects, Weimar Publics, Rethinking the Political Culture of Germany in the 1920s, as well as Object Lessons from and the Formation of Knowledge, the University of Michigan's Museums, Libraries, and Collections. She has published tons of work on US and German museum culture from the 1920s to the present, and has co-curated exhibition projects in Berlin, Dresden, Grand Rapids, and Ann Arbor. Her current book project, Layers of Time, exhibiting time and history in contemporary Germany, examines post-industrial museum and landscape projects, Berlin's Museum Center, and Exhibition of Migration. Dear Kirsten, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you with us. The screen is yours, and as Alice just said before we made this lecture public, it's going to be a banger. Thank you.
Thank you, Barrett. Thank you for this kind introduction. I'm truly delighted to be part of today's event at the American Academy in my hometown, Berlin, and to introduce the presenter of the Nina Maria Gorrison lecture, Alice Goff. Alice is an assistant professor of German history at the University of Chicago. She is a historian of German cultural and intellectual life in the modern period, with a particular focus on the 19th century. Alice received her bachelor from Brian Meyer College and holds a master's degree in archives and records management and a certificate in museum studies from the University of Michigan. From Ann Arbor, she went on to the University of California, Berkeley, to pursue a PhD in history, only to return as a postdoc to the University of Michigan Society of Fellows program immediately after the defense of her dissertation in 2015. Alice's work has furthermore been supported by the Council for Library and Information Resources, the DID, the German Historical Institute, and the Mabel McLeod Lewis Foundation. It is during the 2 years of her postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan that I was fortunate enough to first cross paths with Alice. I was excited to welcome a historian with museum sensibilities and expertise back to our campus and ask Alice to join me in mounting a small exhibition showcasing the fragments of a forgotten on-campus collection of exquisite glass models of marine invertebrates crafted by Dresden-based glass artists Rudolf and Leopold Blaschka in the late 19th century. We bonded over our shared delight in these wondrous glass models of jellyfish and sea slugs and called our small exhibit poetically and lovingly the Museum of Vitreous Ecology. The project would not have been possible without Alice's expertise, but I also learned to treasure her care and wit, both of which I experienced as deeply analytical facilities, which is to say nothing of the friendship that has ensured since that first collaboration, from which I hope others might still follow. Alice's fellowship at the University of Michigan was split between the German Studies Department, where I teach, and the History Department. Ideally, we would have liked to have her also be appointed in art history, as well as in the Museum Studies program. You get the idea. Alice is a consummate interdisciplinary scholar. Her deeply engaging historical work on the long 19th century in France, Prussia, and the German lands, and the intricate way through which she brings into focus the relationship of art and politics, museums, cultural preservation, and the humanities are of interest to scholars across disciplines. Consider for a moment Alice's title for today's talk, Stepping onto the Pedestal, an animating history of art restitution from the Napoleonic Wars. The title sets a historical scene that emphasizes process, movement, and the rise of a new aesthetic. It speaks to Alice's project more generally, as an extended historic moment that witnessed an unprecedented movement of artworks across the German-French border and back. The Napoleonic War paradoxically elevates art and the aesthetic through the processes of looting and restitution. Readers of Alice's work can glean from related published essays how she deftly addresses inanimate art objects as honorable subjects. Among these, let me just single out two pieces. The first, entitled The Object as Ambassador, Exhibitions in Contemporary History. That is her introduction to a forum in the journal Representations that Alice edited in 2018. And a second essay, again putting an artwork front and center, The Honor of the Trophy, a Prussian bronze in the Napoleonic era, that appeared in the same year in a volume on the things they carried, war, migration, and material culture, edited by Leora Ausländer and Tara Zara. The artwork at the center of this essay is no other than one of Berlin's most cherished bronzes, the Praying Boy, now displayed in the Altes Museum. As a museum studies scholar, I'm particularly drawn to the evocative ways in which Alice sets the stage for a new kind of cultural history, literally through her elegant prose and the way she crafts compelling storylines, methodologically through the ways in which she analyzes the theater of the public display of artworks as generative and self-reflexive, and in disciplinary terms through her equal and equally expert attention to the objects of history, the objects of art history, and to questions of philosophy and aesthetics. In her book In Progress, The God Behind the Marble, Transcendence and the Art Object in the German Aesthetic State, the actors who populate the stage of her writing include museum professionals and architects, ministers and museum visitors, philosophers, poets, and clergymen. The artifacts that are put on pedestals in Paris and Berlin are arbiters of specific biographies themselves, who have not only crisscrossed the borders between Prussia and France, but also between the sacred and the secular, war and peace. What Alice is able to show us by restaging the encounters between actors and art objects is how, in these encounters, the 19th century shaped its notions of aesthetics and transcendence, often through decidedly non-transcendent things and actions. In this investigation, Alice joins important voices such as the British Museum scholar Samuel J. Alberti, who reminds us that, and I quote, "museum objects are never stable," end of quote, to begin with. Alice's work capitalizes on their fluidity to enliven, or as she puts it in the title of today's talk, to animate the collective and historically specific work that goes into the making of the objects, their meaning, and their institutions. To anyone interested in contemporary museum studies, then, Alice's work resonates with our contemporary discourses of object restitution and decolonization, for which it provides historical precursors and depth. These and other issues we can surely discuss in the Q&A that will follow Alice's talk, but for now, I would like to pass the proverbial mic across the Atlantic from Ann Arbor to Alice in Berlin. Please welcome Alice Goff.
Thank you so much, Kerstin, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the Blaschkas, because if you hadn't, I was going to. I think that exhibit in some ways, even more than the looting that my research has been concerned with, informed the way I think about the fragility of objects. So it was a formative experience. I'm excited to discuss this paper with you. Thank you also, Barrett, for the warm welcome, and thank you all for tuning into my talk tonight. Before I start, I want to express my deep appreciation to Nina von Matzahn for funding my fellowship, and to the wonderful staff of the American Academy who've made my stay in Berlin so comfortable and productive. And in particular to my fellow fellows, whose community has been especially meaningful in this time of relative isolation. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then I'd look forward to your questions and discussion afterwards. I'd also like to invite those listening in to be in touch by email if you're so moved. These are ideas in formation, so to speak, and it would be great to hear your thoughts, particularly since I cannot see your faces. I'd like to ask you to imagine the following scene. The year is 1806, the height of Napoleon's conquest of Europe, and you are a visitor in Paris, there to see for yourself that cultural epicenter that everyone is talking about as the new Rome. The Musée Napoleon and the Palace of the Louvre, burgeoning at this point with the spoils of French military victory, does not disappoint. Upstairs in the Grand Gallery, a dazzling roster of paintings culled from royal and ecclesiastical collections in Belgium, the Rhineland, northern Italy, Rome, and of course Paris itself, adorn the walls. Among them Raphael's Transfiguration, Van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, Correggio's Madonna of St. Jerome, Paulus Potter's Young Bull. Downstairs, the sculpture galleries contain an equally celebrated onslaught of antiquities, so much so that some report feeling physically unwell at their sight. The Laocoon, the Venus de Medici, the Capitoline Antinous, and the Apollo Belvedere, flanked by columns from Charlemagne's Cathedral in Aachen, as you see here in this painting of the Apollo Gallery by Hubert Robert. Perhaps you are horrified, like the Berlin classicist Alois Hirt, at the chaotic heap of barbaric plunder posing as a grand gesture of civilization. Perhaps, like the Dresden antiquarian Karl August Büttiger, you concede that anyone who knows how to present these works so publicly deserves to have them. Perhaps, like the Prussian writer Johannes Schopenhauer, you find the loud, meaningless blither of the crowds so unbearable, you vow never to go during public hours again. Or maybe, like the English painter William Hazlitt, you find the din of the crowds drowned out by the hum of the masterpieces themselves. Quote, "School called out to school, one great name answered another, swelling the chorus of universal praise." Indeed, you do hear a voice, but it is not the voice of an artwork. It is the voice of a young woman from Provence, exclaiming loudly in front of the Apollo Belvedere. Everyone turns to look. The museum guards startle. A Prussian writer living in Paris at the time, Helmina von Chezy, captures the transfixed woman's desperate admonitions in verse. I'm going to project German translations and speak the English. This, you say, is Apollo of Belvedere, the greatest work that sculptors ever made. It would be so if it were mere marble, but humans never reached such epic heights. Where you see stone, there in the golden sphere, my drunken gaze sees the rays of the god illuminating. Her companion, an older sister perhaps, finally succeeds in tearing her away and ushering her out the door, but the young woman continues to profess as she goes. How can you turn away from these figures so coldly? Does no twinkle of the soul strive to pull you under? Can you only see the marble in the god? The young woman is gone, but the question lingers. You can feel in Chezy's narration the beat of silence before the hum of the galleries resumes, as the onlookers register the outburst, admitting to themselves in the silence that, in fact, maybe they can only see the marble in the god. Perhaps you have experienced something like this beat of silence in a museum before. After a triggered alarm or the scream of a child returns this purportedly decorous space of profound aesthetic experience, communion even, back into the profane realm of the quotidian material every day. I think it is no accident that in Chezy's telling, it is the museum guard, the emblematic master of this mundane realm, who remarks of the young woman that, as stirring as her devotion was, it would have been better for everyone if she had never come. This evening, I'm going to speak about this silence that Chezy conjures in the Napoleonic Louvre, a silence that, in my view, is important to the history of the Museum of Art in Europe and has implications for how we think of museums of art today. Silence in the public museum has long been understood to be a bad thing. Silence figures in the critique of museums as gloomy mausoleums, where objects are removed from the circulation of everyday life and entombed in such stultifying abundance that neutralizes their cultural power. Silence also figures in critiques of the museum as an agent of repression or obfuscation, in which its role in various forms of dispossession and exploitation is carefully kept quiet. In reaction to these critiques, some museums have made an enemy of silence too, rebranding themselves as spaces of dialogue, where not only people speak, but objects speak too. Here in Berlin, the newest such institution goes so far as to state, quote, "We do not understand ourselves to be a museum, but rather a forum." I'm referring, of course, to the Humboldt Forum, which strives to transcend the outcry surrounding its architecture, its organization, and above all, the violent colonial origins of its collections by making dissonance its foundational slogan and controversy the source of its legitimacy. In the words of its founding director, Neil MacGregor, quote, "Dissonance provides room for doubt." And in those of Wilhelm von Humboldt, MacGregor adds, "Doubt torments only those who believe, never those who pursue their own investigations." But the silence that follows the young woman's question, "Can you only see the marble in the god?" is not the silence of museal gloom, nor of colonial amnesia, but rather, I think, a kind of quiet reckoning that has often been elided in the long-standing efforts of both institutions and their critics to make museums lively places, where collections and people speak to each other, if not in a chorus of universal praise as Hazlitt experienced, then at least in a kind of harmonious critical exchange. This silence is instead a fleeting moment of disillusionment, cast into relief by the young woman's delusion, where the museum's loudest and grandest pretensions appear suddenly distinctly limited and mundane, and where the material infrastructures on which they depend, the marbles, the canvases, the bodies of the spectators, the environment they inhabit, emerge from the shadows. The pretensions of the early 19th century museum, and the Musée Napoléon in particular, are what have most often been remembered, particularly by contemporary museum organizers who remain to some extent in these institutions' thrall. Their universalist ambitions, their encyclopedic collections, their commitment to bourgeois cultivation, and the broad-scale liberalization of society through art. Much important scholarship has addressed this history by giving voice to the many people and cultures such pretensions marginalized and erased. My goal today is somewhat different. That is, to restore some silence to the history of those ambitions, to show their limits at the very moment in which they were proposed, and to clarify the prosaic and yet vitally important material challenges that have stood in the way of the centuries-long effort to make the museum a forum. When a visitor stood in the Louvre at the beginning of the 19th century, surrounded by the spoils of Napoleon's continental wars, they faced the very question that the young woman from Provence so urgently posed. For many, the answer was, of course I can see the marble in the god. The Louvre, founded in 1793, was hardly the first public museum of art. It quickly became, however, an extraordinarily persuasive statement of the power of such institutions to remake the social and political order, to quell the violence of the French Revolution, and to enable the cultural rebirth of the French state. As a repository for collections plundered from across old regime Europe, it was also widely understood to be a force for the liberation of art itself. Freed from the incense-filled nooks of religious sanctuaries or the secretive crannies of princely galleries, as the argument went, these works were given a new kind of life. As a poem celebrating the arrival of the Apollo Belvedere in Paris from Rome in 1798 proclaimed, "The sun itself is a flame at your noble image. From you derive the liberty of the world, and the world thus avenged beholds you with reverence." This vase from the porcelain manufactory at Sèvres captures the scene, described by the French historian Dominique Poulot thus, quote, "The triumphant procession contrasts the gold and the detail of the uniforms with the almost supernatural lividity of the statues, reminiscent of Girodet's French heroes entering Ossian's eternity. This lividity signals the apotheosis." I've tried to stitch together some images of that band illustration around the vase so that you can sort of see how it progresses and get a sense for the contrast between gold and marble that Poulot is referring to. This is the Girodet painting in question. In this moment, it is not only eminently possible to see the Apollo as a god on account of his beauty, its displacement and its incorporation in the Napoleonic Louvre itself secures its divine status as a powerful engine of public ennoblement and political salvation. On the other hand, the answer to the young woman's question was just as obviously, of course I can only see the marble in the god. While the French looting campaigns claimed the power to make artworks gods, they just as convincingly affirmed art objects to be quite the opposite: destructible, renameable, losable, and silent, ultimately and often tragically dependent on the words and actions of those around them. As the poet Friedrich Schiller wrote of the antiquities from Italy assembled in Paris, "They to him are silent ever, into life's fresh circle, never from their pedestals come down. The muses are alone possessed by he who holds them in warm breast. To the Vandals they are stone." This was a favorite line of Anti-Napoleonic Critique, pointing out the cultural program of post-revolutionary France as one of desecration rather than salvation, which transformed vaunted masterpieces into spoils of war and thus mere and silent things. We see here, for example, a caricature of the emperor showing off his newly won Apollo with the line, "Ah well, messieurs, 2 million," a reference to the supposed number of conquered objects in his cache, and a signal that it is material quantity rather than artistic quality that is his primary concern. Or here is a kind of, I think, Rosetta Stonification of Bonaparte, in which the transgressions of his regime outlined on his upper body are supported by 2 legs of material goods, which I hope you can see here. On the left side, one representing the commodities of the continental system. You see some sugar beets gathered around the knees. and the other representing objects of art pillaged from different nations. That's the caption running up the right thigh with the Apollo, yes, right there on the right thigh. Each leg, by the way, is supported, you may not be able to see this, by boots fashioned of the corpses of mass conscription. I think both images make clear that the gist of the critique is not only that the Napoleonic pillage makes art into things, but also that it makes people into things too, as with Bonaparte posed in the first image as the statue to which he gestures. But the force of these caricatures of Napoleonic looting, and especially of Schiller's lines, comes from more than humorous exaggeration or poetic license, but rather from a shared statement of inescapable fact. Looting made painfully evident that these objects, even the most luminous among them, were, and always had been, stonily silent, and not just for the Vandals, but for the vanquished too. If we see in the Sèvres vase a procession of gods across the immortalizing threshold of the museum, we might just as well see a parade of highly fragile cargo gingerly making its way along a worryingly ruin-strewn path. This man might be raising his arms in reverence as the Apollo approaches, but he might just as well be raising them in fear at the precariously perched marble with its laurel victory garlands dangling threateningly close to the wheels of its cart. The beat of silence that follows the young woman's lament in the Louvre, "Can you only see the marble and the god?" is a moment of suspension between the promise of classical art's lively divinity and the confrontation with its profane materiality, which the French despoliations in Europe introduced into the history of the modern museum. The book manuscript that I've been completing while in residence at the American Academy tells the story of how German artists, writers, custodians, and administrators of culture understood this conundrum, which in many states of the recently former Holy Roman Empire was not only an abstract aesthetic problem, but an immediate and political one. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic period produced extraordinary confidence among German intellectuals that art was a unique and indispensable source of individual liberty, collective morality, and spiritual truth, the key to the regeneration of society that the French Revolution itself had utterly failed to manifest, and that the collapse of German states in the face of Napoleonic warfare had made all the more urgent. In 1807, as Helmina Fonchezy's report of the young woman from Provence at the Musée Napoleon circulated among German readers, the Prussian reformer Karl von Altenstein sat in Riga contemplating a path forward for the kingdom following catastrophic defeat to the French the fall before. He writes, "The flourishing of the arts is the product and the expression of the highest status of mankind. Everything that is touched by them approaches this higher status. They captivate in their full power all that nears them with omnipotence. Only through them will energetic and powerful life and ascension to the higher status be made possible." End quote. Facilitating this touching encounter was to be both the purpose of the state and the means of its rebirth. The Public Museum of Art was to be among its signature institutional tools. The events that gave rise to these convictions, however, also created deep uncertainty about how art's divinity could be realized in practice. Did the Vatican marbles mean the same thing in Paris as they had in Rome? How did the social setting of the blockbuster museum affect a viewer's ability to appreciate a painting? How to deal with objects whose exhibition generated new and competing theories about their origins and meanings? Could a work of art that had been taken captive still be a source of freedom? As Chazy reminds us, the Museum of Displaced Objects could turn quickly from a space of reverence into one of idolatry, where it was easy to get wrong the proper balance between marble and God. There is not much daylight between her rendering of the young woman's paean to the Apollo and the description of the same object by the renowned art historian and Philhellenist Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who had seen it in the Vatican Sculpture Gallery 60 years earlier and had called it the most perfect embodiment of the ideal of classical beauty. that Winkelmann's breathlessness at the statue helped to inscribe him in the canon of our historical description, while the young woman's rapture earned her a diagnosis in the Times of London as a case of, quote, singular insanity, has much to do with the period's deep suspicion of women as appreciators of art. In Shizzy's rendering, however, the tragedy of the young woman's story is also about the challenge of seeing the ideal of classical beauty incarnate in an object that was also a spoil of war. In this context, the work does not offer life, but rather its opposite, as Shizzy remarks of the young woman at the end of her account, quote, the unfortunate one, she perished from her delusion. The silence of the statue had, in the end, silenced her. The young woman was not alone. Visitors to the Musée Napoleon frequently hesitated to square its liberatory claims with its trophy cabinet mystique, its universalist premises with its provincial audience, the wealth of its collections with the idiosyncrasies of their setting. As the writer and diplomat Karl Varnhagen von Ense admitted, well, the museum was an undeniable phenomenon on the scale of humanity, eine Weltinteresse, he calls it. In front of, quote, world-famous statues, the very mention of which makes your breast heave, I could only stand here so unhappily, indifferent and emotionless, with the cautionary thought that it was not the fault of the gods' images, but rather my own, if they did not enthuse me, end quote. His only comfort was that he was in good company. His erudite companions to the galleries might enthuse at the collections, but their words only thinly veiled the undeniable fact that this brilliant place left them cold too. Now, there's a certain irony that what I have been describing as a kind of silence generated a great deal of commentary, but there was real silence too. While news and reactions to the French looting campaigns in Italy circulated widely in the German press, public reactions to other fronts of the so-called Kunstraub or art robbery is subdued. This is true even of the looting in German territories in 1794 and after in the Rhineland, for example, or in 1806 and 7 in Prussia, Braunschweig, and Hessen-Kassel too. As the historian Benedict Savoy has pointed out, these silences are not entirely attributable to the censor. They also reflect a certain ambivalence. Maybe these objects were better off in Paris. Maybe their seizure by French museum officials was a gesture of respect for the value of German collections. Or maybe dispossession was ultimately meaningless, as Schiller had argued. The muses are alone possessed by he who holds them in warm breast. To the vandal they are stone. If the civilized appreciation of art takes place on ultimately immaterial terms, who cares where the things themselves happen to be? In 1814 and 15, with the fall of the Napoleonic regime, one might expect these ambivalent silences to end. In a way, in fact, they did. Across Europe, states moved to reclaim cultural property seized during French occupation, an effort in which Prussia played a leading role. Restitution was an opportunity to bring art to life, to give it a speaking role in the revitalization of the state, and to gather the resources necessary to fulfill Altenstein's 1807 vision. This reanimation of art got started right away in a series of festivals of liberation for returning artworks, which imitated those staged to honor demobilizing troops. For objects from provincial collections, and in particular for church property in new or reincorporated Prussian territories, such occasions were opportunities to transform local treasures into emblems of the beneficence of the newly expanded Prussian kingdom. In Cologne, the revered hometown hero Rubens' crucifixion of St. Peter was welcomed back on the second anniversary of the Battle of Leipzig, with 3 church services, a parade of militia, 50 girls and boys in formal dress, 70 dignitaries of the learned and artistic community, and of course the painting itself, shrouded with black silk cloth for the big reveal in the sanctuary of its former home, the Church of St. Peter, where a Te Deum was said and fireworks, feasting, and dancing on the square outside proceeded well into the night. For Berlin's Quadriga, notoriously removed in 1806 from the Brandenburg Gate, the procession of 15 crates on large wagons across the German countryside from Paris home also offered an opportunity to build collective goodwill. As the shipment made its way eastward, village bells were rung, refreshments were served to the detail of 25 men and 32 horses. Well-wishers pinned messages to the statue on the sides of the packages, and young women threw green boughs and flower wreaths in their wake. A caricature by the engraver Daniel Berger, commemorating the monument's restoration, depicts Victoria herself driving herself back to her rightful position on top of the Brandenburg Gate, dragging backwards behind her the French convoy that had abducted her several years earlier. Facing forward, the sculpture was filled with spirited determination and living force. Facing backwards were its human and animal tormentors, exhausted, spiritless, and inert. Arrogance took her away, the caption read, bravery brings her back. While restituted artworks returned with extraordinary vitality in the immediate post-Napoleonic period, much of the ambivalence that the Kunstraub had introduced remained. While the French had justified looting as an act of liberation, the Prussian restitutions were a re-liberation, which had to deal with the memory of objects' displacement that had made painfully evident that not only was art not free, but that it was completely at the mercy of those who were. Many of the messages pinned to the crates of the Quadriga, for example, express this apparent contradiction. Karl Ruppin, a saddler from Caesar, wrote to the packages, "You were so far away, but it makes no difference if you didn't pick up any French," before then conceding that this might have been because the addressee was made of bronze. Quote, "Such an object is cherished, honored, and even if it is often degraded, it is never forsaken." At the same time that these works returned alive in the eyes of their Prussian beholders, they also came back bearing more acutely than before signs of their vulnerability to the contingencies of politics and their dependence on administrative infrastructures to keep them firmly in their place. The return into life's fresh circle, as Schiller had put it, was not to be a step off the pedestal, but rather a step on. Most artists, scholars, and officials agreed that such infrastructures should not be exclusively royal ones. As ornaments of Hohenzollern palaces, Prussian collections had been uniquely vulnerable to French looting, both official and illicit, some argued. A public museum on the cultural political agenda in Berlin since 1797 at least became an important post-war priority, both for the revitalization of Prussian society and for the protection of Prussian art. As an anonymous commentator put it, quote, "To actually have something means to act in the spirit of ownership. One can only have artworks when they are consistently and freely accessible and can transfer their deep meanings to us and make our talents productive," end quote. If restitution were to be permanent, it would have to be an act of public appropriation. But views on what this appropriation should look like were strongly divided. Should restituted objects be exhibited along with the entirety of the royal collections, ancient sculptures alongside plaster casts, European alongside non-European art, pre-modern along with modern collections? Should a public museum celebrate Prussian military glory the way the Louvre had celebrated French? Should it convey a clear history of German as opposed to classical art? Should it serve an academic public or a popular one? The language through which intellectuals had articulated the transformative power of art for society had emerged through the experience of dispossession. It now had to confront the challenges of repossession, in which questions of liberty, autonomy, and regeneration became logistical rather than theoretical concerns. In 1807, Altenstein had written, quote, "There is no need to expand on the way in which, through the arts, all the most important spiritual powers can be lifted up and enlivened," end quote. He was wrong. It was precisely this silence that the post-Napoleonic period struggled to address. I think, but did not overcome. Let me conclude with an episode from this transitional period that I hope will make clear that even in a moment of debate and dissonance that might make advocates of the museum as forum proud, a certain quiet remained. In October of 1815, the Prussian Academy of Arts staged an exhibition of restituted royal art collections. a preliminary gesture conceived as a preamble to their more permanent incorporation into a public museum of art. The centerpiece of this exhibition, however, was not an object of the royal collections at all, but rather this work, a 15th century triptych altar piece now attributed to Hans Memling, taken from by the French from the Church of St. Mary in the West Prussian city of Danzig in 1807. It is a painting that, though its beauty was said to have surpassed the achievements of a mere mortal artist, was also appreciated by its 19th century interpreters as deeply, even too corporeal. Naked bodies emerged from their earthen graves, splayed across the landscape as the damned are separated from the saved. At the center of the action stands Michael, his gleaming armor reflecting the battle of humanity around him as he weighs a pair of bodies to determine their fate. Demons herd the unfortunate into the right panel. St. Peter takes the hands of the righteous on the left as they are fitted with robes and file into the marble hall of heaven. Commentary on the work featured in particular the impressively diverse grouping of figures that populate its surface, oddly emphasized, as many noted, through their elongation. Some writers worriedly pointed out that the descending figures exhibited more nuance and liveliness of expression than the rather flat and homogeneous affects of those ascending. The work was intended to return to Danzig, but once it was on display, it began to generate a great deal of attention and discussion, particularly over its authorship. In Paris, it had been attributed to Jan van Eyck, placing it at an illustrious originary moment of the Northern European art tradition. In Berlin, other theories began to emerge that would make it more or less a work of German national heritage. The organizer of the exhibition, Johann Gottfried Schadow, proposed Michael Wohlgemuth, teacher of Dürer. A competing theory by the classicist Alois Hirt suggested the Flemish Hugo van der Goes. In any case, the vitality of the image and the energetic discussion of its history suggested it as a perfect candidate for a future public museum of art in Berlin. Hirt wrote, quote, "I do not doubt that in Danzig there will be some appreciators, but in general, it would remain there a dead artistic treasure." The Danziger, as might be expected, did not agree. Payments, replacements, scholarships were offered and rebuffed. The parties were at an impasse. Given the repeated claims that a public museum of art was the premier way to secure the lively participation of the arts in Prussian society, it is perhaps not surprising that the altar should itself enter the debate on its own fate. On October 31st, 1815, in the daily newspaper, the Berlinische Nachrichten, this is exactly what it did, under the headline, "Statement by the Danzig Painting, depicting the Last Judgment to its friends." In frank and unadorned language, the altar offered its own opinion on its recent experience in France, its hopes for its future, and the direction of cultural politics in post-Napoleonic Prussia more broadly. Its primary rhetorical strategy was to use the subject of its image, the Last Judgment, as the source of its curatorial authority. It began, "Before the Savior came the Antichrist, who added me to his stolen treasures in order to reinforce his empire of lies. By the time his talons ferreted me out from the farthest corner of this vanquished German pedestal, I had lay interred in the same place in a church in Danzig for centuries. Declared as a fitting prize by the French, I landed in the museum in Paris, and I would lie if I said I had not found the journey most useful. I came to belong once again truly to the living. It was my own resurrection." Only its continued installation in a public national context could ensure that it stayed among the sentient, in other words. The altar continues, quote, "I, the Danziger painting, who am a living example of such a fruitless existence, urgently call upon you to plead with your Lord and King to exhibit these trophies of war in a Prussian-German museum for the artistic education of peace," end quote. It then decried the deplorable conditions in Danzig. It enumerated the benefits of public arts education to the well-being of the state. It backed up its positions with evidence gathered from the conversations it had overheard from its viewers in Paris. And I have to take a quick detour now to show you an image I just found this morning of this very moment, people discussing in the Louvre in front of the painting. It's a caricature of what English families do when they go to museums, which is, as you can see, not look at the art. It says an English family at the museum in Paris, and up top it says another one. But I think you can unmistakably see the Danzig painting in the background there. Anyways, a little thrill. Back to the painting though. 3 columns later, the altar signed off, quote, "If these words are for naught, if you do not feel their deep truths and you do not want to do anything about it, then I, an old honest German painting, have seen farther than you, and all will remain as it was, because it will not yet be time. Live well." End quote. Live well. It's a remarkably perfect expression of art's determinative power for social renewal, a painting that not only inspires you to live well, but commands you to do so. What more perfect illustration of Altenstein's hope that state support for the arts could produce energetic and powerful life? The last judgment's entreaty in the pages of the Berlinische Nachrichten was not only a plea for the creation of a public museum, it was a performance of the very quality of art that demanded public institutionalization. In speaking, the last judgment had become the perfect museum object. If the young woman from Provence had been here, she might have been forgiven for falling to her knees. On the other hand, live well might appear more a concession of weakness than a statement of power. The altar could not actually take up its quill and must end thus on an agnostic note, more shrug than benediction. Shortly after the editorial appeared in the Berlinische Nachrichten, a response was published in the Rheinischer Merkur, in which its author claimed to have spoken with the altar and to have heard all of the souls on its surface proclaim their homesickness for Danzig. As with its abduction, in the end, what the altar said, or what the altar was said to have said, had absolutely no bearing on its fate. Indeed, the painting returned not a year later to Danzig, statement to its friends be damned. It arrived on December 16, 1816, and was installed in the Church of St. Mary a month later amidst a festival celebration. Upon its return, municipal officials sentenced the altar to the following utterance, fixed firmly to the bottom of its central panel, quote, "When thieves of treasures captured the eternal judgment, the just monarch gave us the hard-won object back." Underscoring the work's utter passivity during its recent travails, its seizure by thieves, its return at the behest of the king, the plaque ensured that the altar would not be tempted to speak up again, or worse, to walk away. Despite its lack of effect, I think we must not, however, dismiss the altar's feat of speech as simply a clever or amusing ruse. The altar, after all, has not come to life to speak of its ideal beauty, nor of its national meaning, nor of its sovereign power to elevate and transform society. It has come alive to speak above all of the most quotidian, if also most fraught, question that can concern a painting, where it should hang. And this is a question that the altar fully admits it is powerless to decide. Quote, "It is as if a great general who could rescue the fatherland were to be made major of a civilian militia of some far-flung city where he has friends, but can have no impact." The altar complained of the prospect of its restitution. This was not an expression of the altar's autonomous aesthetic power or its embodiment of freedom or even its divinity, despite the image on its surface. This was a work of art come to life to speak of its vulnerabilities, of the logistical challenges that affected its position in the world, rather than of its powers to transcend these. It spoke of its own silence, of the unfortunate but undeniable fact that it required others to determine its fate. It was the silence of the altar that put it on its pedestal. The Napoleonic period and its aftermath offers an exceptionally alluring resource for thinking about the value and the purpose of museums of art in our contemporary world. It produced a powerful cultural political language for articulating the promise of art to both nation and humanity, for envisioning a lively dialogue between people and objects, and for imagining the ennobling effects of such encounters in which both sides set each other free. In the words of the art historian Horst Bredekamp on the occasion of his acceptance of the Schiller Prize in 2017, quote, "In the work of art, there appears something unconditional, etwas Unbedingtes, and therefore lively, that has nothing to prove. This unconditionality should transfer to the viewer and determine his identity. Herein lies the reason why art unsettles and elevates, stirs, and deplaces." That last word, which I've translated as deplaces, but more literally is exterritorializes, is in my view, the operative one. If this language has been used by European museums today to transcend urgent questions of the provenance of their collections and the demands for their return, this is not necessarily a surprise. These ideas, after all, developed in the context of the despoliation of cultural property and were deployed to evade the challenges these despoliations introduced. The French looting of European art was a vastly different form of despoliation than the European looting of non-European art, in particular the dispossession of colonized peoples in the latter half of the 19th century, which has been the primary focus of restitution claims today. My observation is that the rhetoric of the former has been brought to bear on the latter, as in Schiller's phrase, "To the Vandals they are stone." This, as I've tried to show tonight, is only half the story. It is a view of the early 19th century that listens to what is being said about art rather than what is being done with it. It is a view that erases the silences of the period and replaces them with confident certainties. It is a view that dissolves the dissonances of this moment of conflict and upheaval into a chorus of universal praise. If we are to listen to someone from the beginning of the museum age, let it be the young woman from Provence. And let us not answer her right away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Alice. I applaud in the name of everybody who has listened to you. This is always the silence of Zoom,
Yeah, right.
that we would like to transcend at the end of such wonderful lecture. And I just wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function to post your questions. You can also post comments, everything you want to would like to share with Alice. Please post via the Q&A function. And just so that we begin, I would like to open with a question about these two concepts that are so central to your talk today, but also I think to your work more generally, doubt and silence. Concepts that are woven throughout your paper. As you know, with your other writings, I'm deeply intrigued by the wealth of voices you bring to our attention, and also the deep archive in which your work operates. So could you comment on your historical and archival method and the role doubt and silence play within it? How do these two modes, I'm asking myself and you, inform each other and your historiography?
Thanks so much, Kerstin. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think actually it is the way I think about archives in some way that is pretty important to the way I think about art. I went to the archive to start the research for this project, kind of expecting to find, I think my idea was find people misbehaving in museums, which of course is not a particularly productive question to approach the archive with. I did find something right away, but then a long silence, so to speak. But what I did find was, the way that the museum works in a very technical and prosaic way. And it quickly became clear to me that in order to write a history of museums, it's been imperative for people to sort of transcend at some level that profane everyday world. to kind of make the archive work for the story, but maybe not to feature it as such. I mean, there's obviously been really important archivally rooted work on museums. I don't mean to suggest that the archive's been ignored, but there's this kind of register of just normal life in the museum that is often gets elided, and I think is really interesting, because in those really prosaic encounters when, for example, I've been working a little bit with gallery servants in the Altes Museum when they're arguing about when to varnish the paintings and whether they should work on Sundays and whether that's a violation of religious freedoms to have to varnish paintings on Sunday, for example. That the kind of this irony emerges between the museum's stated purpose and its kind of operational reality. And it's that tension that I think I'm calling silence in the purpose for the purposes today to be able to talk about this idea of the museum as a place of dialogue, but which is a kind of, I just think, an unresolved tension that ought to be amplified in the history of the institution.
I would be interested in hearing more about the implicit polemic made explicit towards the end, the distinction between the claims made or assumed about the nature of post-colonial restitutions as opposed to the claims activated in the post-Napoleonic period. There may be more continuities in the stories in both periods. No, question mark. So are there not? So that also, you know, it's like a question about the arc that you have so beautifully opened up for us.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about that arc and how you understand that arc?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that there isn't colonial looting going on in this period. Certainly there is. But I think from the German perspective and my admittedly sort of outsider view of the debates going on, I mentioned the Humboldt Forum several times in the talk, that there seems to be a kind of folding of the 19th century in half at work in the German field, where its humanist beginnings get sort of brought to bear on the colonial transgressions of its end. And that's an unfair folding. I think it's an unfair reading of the 19th century. But my goal is really to show that humanist tradition already contains within it. I mean, it was operative in despoliation at the beginning of the 19th century, but it sort of gets used as a kind of clean legacy that museums today can fall back on, a kind of German humanist liberal tradition. And I'm trying to show the kind of gaps in that rhetoric, even in some ways on its own terms. I think there are certainly other ways to approach the issue, and there's a lot of really exciting work going on in this field right now. But this kind of discrepancy between language and things is the kind of intervention that I'm bringing to bear on that tradition.
Great. I was also, listening to your talk, I was also struck by the notion of property and cultural property and patrimony or patrimoine, patrimony, Kulturbesitz, that these notions that are now also in between practices of restitution, for example, in France, where these laws just make it so difficult to, and they have to change for each individual object that France is repatriating. They have to be a parliamentary act. Mm-hmm. So, how do you see that history of that notion of cultural property, and how important is the Napoleonic era for our contemporary understanding of that notion of Kulturbesitz?
Yeah, I mean, and it's really interesting because in some ways this period is not very instructive for the idea of cultural property today, because we're dealing in a world where there really aren't legal codifications of what cultural property means. And part of what draws me to the period is this sort of fluidity where there's an emerging sense that there is a category of culture that ought to be protected in times of war. But there's also a fundamental kind of ambivalence about what the French are doing, even on the German side. It's fully understood that this is a gesture of imitation of the Roman Empire, for example, and that's not necessarily a gesture that a lot of German classicists particularly are so interested in opposing. And it's that kind of uncertainty about whether looting is a violation of the object that I think produces this interesting duplicity between a kind of language that assumes that these things aren't things, that they are gods, and a kind of reality of the way that they're being handled on the ground. And I think what happens, if I were to boldly sketch a narrative of the 19th century, is that that sort of irony closes as there a kind of legal language for dealing with art as objects emerges, and cultural politics become more established as a prime function of the state. This is the moment where all those things are being figured out.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important for the understanding also of the contemporary moment we are in, and for our contemporary discourses on restitution and repatriation. There is a related question here. I think you have answered it, but let me read it to you. During Napoleon's reign before 1814, was there any public discussion about the Kunstraub and restitution comparable to what we're seeing right now about the colonial Kunstraub?
So is there a repatriation?
So that notion of Kunstraub, I think you have answered it. Mm-hmm. So before 1814, was there any public discussion about that notion of Kunstraub, of looting, of art looting, and restitution comparable to what we're seeing right now about the colonial Kunstraub?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that I would say that there's a kind of comparable discourse going on, in large part because from the German perspective, at least, and I think this is pretty true for Europe broadly, colonial dispossession is not being talked about as an outrage. It's really actually the Italian campaigns that light the Germans' fire, in a way that the looting of the Rhineland or the secularization of church property does not motivate people in the same way. So there's this kind of idea of the assault on this classical tradition, a tradition that is sort of held up as the kind of key central pillar of a European idea of humanity, that's being violated, and that's where the outrage comes from. But there is certainly not an outcry about other kinds of displacement. There's a robust art market in this period. There is, yes, an emerging discourse about that things should be appreciated in the context in which they were made, or in the context where they have historically been shown. But it is not applied across the board. And the same people who object to Napoleon's displacements in Italy, for example, are fully happy for the Elgin marbles to go to London. So there's just a lot of inconsistency in a way that I think is not so much part of the contemporary debate.
Yeah. Although there's also inconsistency
in
contemporary debate, which yes, but it's you're right. It was just making me think
more inconsistency.
The different kinds of inconsistency that we really need to pay attention to, right? Yeah. So here's another question. What a gorgeous talk. I'm wondering, what was the place of art, both classical and German, in mandatory public education at this time? When do museums start to have educational programs in-house? And what did any of those look like at the time, if there are any, or if there were any?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's not a program the way we think about museum education today. But there is a clear sense that maybe museums should really just be for the training of artists, and not for the public. So in some ways, it's a kind of anti-museum education, if we're using contemporary terms. That is, these things are really for the edification of a privileged few who are training to be artists. That in Berlin, the museum, the first public museum that opens out of this period is the Altes Museum, and it is explicitly designed not to be that, to be sort of for public edification, but it is not an institution with an education program. And I have to say, I'm not sure exactly when something that we might recognize as museum education would emerge. Do you know, Kerstin, when that phenomenon? It sounds like it would be an early 20th century thing to me, but
it's part of the new museum movement in the 20th century, and new ways to think about didactical displays. Yeah.
Right.
But
and so
it's a really interesting question. Yeah.
I think that move is also an interesting moment, because it also produces this history that I'm trying to resist of the museum as a cemetery or as a dead space. This is like a turn of the 20th century kind of idea that will produce museum reforms, efforts to make museums more tightly integrated in public educational programs and part of urban spaces in a more active way, rather than often parks.
It's definitely, it's tied to the museum reform, the reorganization of collections and new forms of display on Berlin's Museum Island in the Bode Museum, or the reorganization of the ethnographical collections at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah. Thanks, Alice, for such rich presentations. As another listener, you've put so much on the table. Could you talk more about the actual spaces in which those encounters between viewers and artworks that, in your words, set each other free, took place? How did these ambitions for viewers' relations to artworks influence the physical forms and designs that these young and evolving public museums took? You opened your presentation with that wonderful vignette of the overwhelming, even gaudy Napoleonic juxtaposition of masterworks. How did the earliest French and German public museums refine this display practice in order to more effectively occasion the kind of exchanges they hope to create for the viewers and their artworks? It's a little bit related to what we just discussed, but it brings us, it turns us back to the 19th century and the first museum buildings in Berlin and other places.
Yeah, and the Paris and the Berlin connection is really interesting to think about in this regard, because a lot of the commentary on the Musée Napoleon, which I sort of touched on in the talk, but didn't go into extensively, really sees the physical space as sort of unconducive to a kind of godly experience of art. And this was not the only kind of experience that people thought was good or possible, but I think in some ways what Chazy is doing is showing the preposterousness of the Louvre as a place for having any kind of communion, a kind of romantic idea of what aesthetic experience should be. One of the features that gets talked about in the commentary a lot is that you could stand in front of the Laocoon and then turn your head to the right and see the Apollo Belvedere. And that move was supposed to kind of just pack a punch in a way that was overwhelming. And people really do talk about nausea in the space, and they talk about the dirt of the space. And these are all sort of, in some cases, veiled critiques of the masses and critiques of the museum's publicness, but they're also responses to the blockbuster quality of the collections. The Altes Museum, which will, I think is in some ways, Prussian response to the Musée Napoleon, takes a quite different path, which is a very limited display of collections in a space that is deliberately conceived of as a sanctuary. And that's a hugely controversial decision. It's one of the reasons why I think the Altes Museum is so fascinating, and particularly as a conversation piece for the Humboldt Forum, which it sits across from, is that it has this extraordinarily ambitious idea of what it should be like to experience art. The rotunda of Schinkel's building is supposed to kind of lift your gaze up immediately. The praying boy, as you mentioned earlier, Kerstin, is sort of the signature, I think, what you're supposed to do in that space. The statue is sort of a model of what viewership is supposed to look like. Of course, none of these spaces are really ever all that. There's noise, there are accidents, there's winter mud. And so there's always this tension between how museum organizers and how philosophers of aesthetics think about seeing art and the way art is actually seen. It's never, maybe this is controversial, but I'm not sure it's ever that transcendent. It's meaningful, but transcendence is not the word I would describe for, at least for any museum I've been to.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I said that in my introduction, that's so intriguing how you turn transcendence, you really turn it into an object of study. And it becomes a boundary object.
Yeah.
Which communities form, and you show us how that is happening.
Exactly.
And what the limits are, but also what the possibilities are.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's what is, it's exactly that. It's a boundary object, because the people who are actually tasked with making the claims of the Humboldts and the Schillers and the Hegels into institutional realities are the sort of the middle management, or even the kind of workers in the spaces who, I mean, are more or less invested in the sort of philosophical pretensions of the space, but get caught in these weird moments where they can never fully deliver what the letters on the aesthetic education of man, for example, want to be delivered. And also in some ways, I think transcendence is immeasurable. You can't really see ever whether it's worked. And that's, I think, something that museums don't always disclose.
So we are almost at an end here, and there are lots of questions here that you will see. I would like to bring to the floor one question here. As a practicing artist today, should we not give back our trophies from Humboldt Forum today and leave the forum simply empty? And I would like to add a question here. You are questioning the possibility of the museum as forum, or of the, sort of, how would you imagine the museum as forum? So should we empty the Humboldt Forum out and just let it stand as the architecture it is? And on the other hand, how can we imagine a museum as forum today?
Yeah, that's a scary question, because I don't know that I want to give a counter proposal, but I do want to sort of, I guess, endorse some that I think are really interesting to contemplate. And those are not the ones that are about emptying the museum of its objects and letting the building stand. The building itself has, I think, its own difficulties. but rather scholars and activists who are thinking about ways to unwind it, or actually in some ways silence it, or there's this tear down the Humboldt form, this kind of imagining of its dismantling in ways that would be a kind of monument itself, which I think are really interesting. And some of them are sort of commenting on the fact that this site has been built and taken down and built and taken down. So there's this kind of ecology of the space that any claim to a permanent fixture in the city seems sort of short-sighted. Yeah, it's that kind of mobilization of silence as a form of critique that I find really exciting and productive.
This is wonderful, Alice. Maybe just one more question before we end. One listener asked, could you also speak to the threat of the free market assault on notions of public interest and the role of the state in protecting cultural assets society? This seems a greater threat than the discourse over which among public state museum curators should have custody, in the sense of political economic pressure to contract. Oh, so this is a long winding question, sorry to read it out loud, about you know, the assault of a free market on and the balance between free market exchange of goods, including looted artifacts, and the notion of public interest and public art and protected cultural property.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have much to say about the contemporary situation, except that I find it concerning, the privatization of public interests. I guess I would say that a way that I think the work that I've shared with you tonight might be instructive for thinking about those questions is that what I'm asking is that the idea of publicness be sort of interrogated and shown as a material problem and not just a kind of ideal one. And I think when we do that, we find that the idea of a public museum has always been in some ways compromised, and not always by corporate interests, for example, or free markets, but there's the seamlessness of the idea of public, I think, is not a historically grounded one. And I think this is an interesting period. It's a period that generates the ideals, but it is a period that also generates the compromises, I think.
And these compromises are still with us and thus need more interrogation, and your work helps us to do that kind of work. So thank you, Alice, and I will turn the mic back to Berit.
Thank you so much, Kerstin. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, both Alice and Kerstin. This was a fascinating talk and excellently moderated Q&A, and Alice, the amount of questions and your interrogation really proves that there is so much more interest in the topic. And I think, yeah, we could have continued this for much longer. However, sadly, we have to end. Our next event at the American Academy will be on Thursday, with Steve Pfeiffer talking about the difficult Mr. Putin. And there's another event that I want to draw your attention to on July 5th with Liliane Weisberg from the University of Pennsylvania, who will, and that talk will be in German and will be entitled Schreiben von unterwegs, Postkarten von Walter Benjamin. This would be the inaugural event of the American Academy with the Dresden State Art Collections. That normally would happen in Dresden. This time, due to the current situation, it will happen internationally, and you are all very welcome to tune in. Thank you so much, Alice and Kerstin. Bye-bye.